What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, we speak with Christian Madsbjerg. Christian is founder of Red Associates, a consultancy group focused on helping companies bridge the qualitative divide between themselves, their products, and their customers. The sociologists, anthropologists, economists, journalists, and designers who make up Red employ the methods of social science to study human behavior. Instead of minimizing complexity, they embrace the non-linearities, helping companies reinvent themselves and their products from the bottom up. In this episode, we examine the world from the perspective of human experience, what philosophers call phenomenology. Rather than try to objectify reality, we will revel in its subjectivity. Rather than discount our senses in favor of hard data, we will discount the data in favor of our experience. Experience matters. Reality is messy. Data is fuzzy. The problem of consciousness is hard. Try as we might to fit the world to our models, reality has a stubborn way of eluding even the most disciplined researcher. The most experienced traders don't make decisions off a spreadsheet. They use their intuition, the same intuition that you use when deciding who you can trust, if the price you are paying for something is too high, or if there's just something off about a room or a scene or a story you've just heard. To discount the authoritative wisdom that comes from lived experience is to discount the value of the very question that has led you down the path of inquiry. It is to discount everything that makes life meaningful. And if we want to understand the world around us, why we do what we do, then that journey must begin and end with the human experience. As always, you can gain access to reading lists put together by me ahead of every episode by visiting the show's website at hiddenforcespod.com. Lastly, if you are listening to this show on iTunes or Android, make sure to subscribe. If you like the show, write us a review. And if you want a sneak peek into how the sausage is made, or for special storylines told through pictures and questions, then like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod. And now, let's get right into this week's conversation. So, Christian Madsbjerg, it's wonderful having you in studio. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I met you and first, in fact, heard you speak at David Kirkpatrick's Techonomy Conference, which our listeners know because David was on our program. He was actually our episode 1 on the show. And I really liked what you had to say. I found a deep level of kinship with your approach to... It's difficult for me to even kind of express it. Our listeners will know some of what I'm referring to from the episode on philosophical mathematics, Wittgenstein. It's a challenge for me to express what it is exactly that I found appealing with your perspective. But why don't you tell us a little bit first about who you are, and then we can proceed further in this discussion where we would like to take it.
I suppose that I should have been an academic philosopher, but I was so bored in university. I found it dreadful and political, and it seemed like people were fighting over very small things. So instead of that, I chose to figure out a way to do philosophy or be interested in the kinds of topics that I was interested in other ways than the traditional way. So I founded a consultancy when I was 22 or 23, and I sold that, and I did another one, and that was merged with a bigger company and so on. So this is my third or fourth version of the same company, really, which is trying to use sophisticated theory about human beings to understand us and understand our life, and use that to figure out how to make things, how to make cars and phones and medicine and all kinds of things.
You found a way to make philosophy profitable.
Right.
You bridge another way, would it be fair to say, is you bridge the qualitative divide between us and data, us and the quantified world?
Right. Yeah, so the big deal right now in the business world is, of course, that there's a new set of data we can get our hands on. And that is the data that tracks us, what we click on, where we move. And in your phone, you would have 80 different things that it can measure and know about you. And that's a huge step forward in terms of the way that we've understood markets before, because the way we understood markets before was by asking people. And we're notoriously poor at figuring out what we want or like, or what we do. So when we say we cook in a certain way, it's probably untrue. And when we say we dress in a certain way, it's probably untrue. So the big data world and the new data sets that's come about are exciting, yet they're not a truth machine. And that's sort of my critique of it, is that people think that the data sets that we now have from the digital world is a map of the world, which it definitely isn't. And it also matters who asks questions and how we ask questions to that data, and that is largely overlooked. And that's why we make so many mistakes.
You're saying it is a map, it is not the world, or it is not a map?
It's a map, but it's not of the world.
Exactly.
It's a map of some part of the world, but not the entire thing.
It's interesting that you say that, because another thing I was thinking about while reading your book in preparation for this interview is the distinction between the map and the territory.
Right.
And I do think that we do suffer from this conditioning increasingly in a digital world, where we've mistaken the map for the territory.
Right.
So I want to get into that, and we will. But before we do that, I want to ask you something, because I am curious. You described it very well. You are a very philosophical person, and you found a way to apply philosophical principles and ideas and thinking and introspection and a certain humility. I think you have a good sense of humility around what is knowable. I mean, we'll get into Heidegger and being, because I think that's very relevant as well to this, and phenomenology and experiential knowledge and authoritative wisdom that comes from lived experience. I think that's very powerful. But when I was reading you, I couldn't help but sort of empathize again with some, like when I saw you speak at the Economy, I empathized with some of your perspectives, and I thought to myself, well, what was this person's life like growing up? And I am curious about that. So you're from Denmark. I don't know what the culture is like there and how people respond to philosophical inquiry, if they think it's a waste of time, if they don't. In America, I think for the most part it's considered kind of a waste of time. You're asking questions that don't have answers or whatever. I certainly was very sort of introspective, very curious. I had these big questions as a kid and no real answers, and I felt very alone in that journey for me. I'm curious, what was that like for you growing up, and when did you begin to ask these questions? When did you start looking at the world, and when did you realize that you were looking at the world differently than others, and did you have people in your life to sort of make you feel that this was or was not normal, or whatever else?
Right. That was 17 questions in one, but I'll take it from one end.
Yeah.
I think I've always been a reader, and I've loved the act of reading. Is probably some of the times I'm most happy is when I read what happened 200 years ago or what other people thought about something. And I find it amazing that people had the same thoughts and feelings that I have right now in Syria 400 years ago.
Isn't that amazing?
It's just time travel almost. And I very early on found that. I think some people say that there's a correlation between literary criticism and asthma. And I think one of the reasons...
And asthma?
Yeah, because the more asthma you have, the more books you read. And I had asthma as a kid, so I ended up reading a lot. It's not, though, in Denmark, there isn't an anti-intellectual culture. You have at least half of the population would be interested in books and would be talking about it, and it's a completely reasonable thing to spend your time on. And there's a concept of being cultured, which is part of the culture, that is okay to know about music and our songs and our stories and so on. That's part of being a human being. And even though that's not productive in the sense of most crude sense of the word, it certainly is part of life to know what kind of music they played and made up in the 1890s and so on. So it's not, I didn't have probably the loneliness that you describe, but I was probably a bit more excessive in the area of reading than most people. And then I found very early that I liked seeing patterns in things. I like seeing why people do what they do and so on. So I started being an observer and a listener more than a speaker and a doer. And I like sort of waiting a little bit before I make conclusions and cast judgments. And I think I found that the people that understood things were the ones that listened a lot. So casting judgment is something that is necessary, but only at the point where you know. And I just felt that people did it very fast. And in America, when I moved to America around a decade ago, I found a culture where people have the decision before they've even done the inquiry, and then try to spend a lot of time on fitting the data to that conclusion. And I found that sort of unhelpful and weird.
Well, especially in media, that's definitely true.
Right.
I also worked for a really wonderful man, but he used to say, we're going to do a bunch of focus groups, we're going to do all this and that, and then we're going to do whatever we want anyway.
Right.
which made him very human. So listening to you talk, one of the things that struck me is, and I just wanted to say this, again, I find kinship with this idea that you found companionship in the works of other people who had written, perhaps lived millennia before you, which I relate to that very much. And I also was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking about Denmark, which is an interesting case because Denmark has for a very long time been a very homogeneous culture.
Right.
And it's very interesting that you are sort of partly in the business of bridging cultural gaps,
right,
and cultural divides, which is something that I will want to get into.
There's something to that, though, that it's also the most open economy in the world, which means that you can't stay and build walls around yourself if you want to survive.
Because it's so small.
It's so small. So you have to trade, and it's been a sort of a trading, seafaring nation. So language is important. Nobody speaks Danish. So you have to learn Russian, and you have to learn German, and you have to learn French, and so on, if you want to trade with anybody. And if you want to trade with them, you also need to understand where they come from and what their world is like. So even though it's a very homogeneous country, it's also a country that is so weak and have lost every single war for 1,000 years that since the Vikings, really, that it's only gotten smaller. And that means that you have to compete in other means, and cultural understanding and learning languages and so on is one way.
Those northern Nordic countries are beautiful. Gorgeous countries.
In the summer, in a couple of weeks in the summer.
Yeah, but also like just in general, the architecture, the interiors of the homes, I imagine in large part because so much of the time must be spent inside because of the winters, and also because there's more material wealth that can be accumulated because less of it is spent sort of, I think I'm Greek, and I think about how in Greece people would traditionally spend so much money sort of having a great time, but there's so much beauty in Greece to spend your time outside, to go and spend it by the beach or whatever else. So let me ask you this. So in the context of what we're saying, now we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about sort of how your progression in these questions, and there's something that comes up in your books and when I've heard you speak, and that deals with the humanities. And this is where I would like to take this now, because you also cite a number of people in your work who have given you inspiration or with whom you connect, one of who is Edward O. Wilson, the famous biologist. I've actually read, I assume you may have as well, his book on the meaning of human existence. Mm-hmm. And there's this great quote in that book that deals with the humanities, where he specifically says that if aliens were to visit us, what they would take from our society would not be our science. They would find it dismal and useless. They have far surpassed us. They would instead be fascinated with our humanities.
Right.
And so that's where I would like to, kind of move us now to discuss sort of what the humanities are to you. And then let's have a conversation about what the humanities are to us. What is the significance of the humanities? Because you have some very great things to say about that in your book.
Yeah. So there are two sides to that story. There is the big story, which is the meaning of our culture, is the way we create beauty and the way we try to understand the world we live in. And I think Winston Churchill said that when he was asked to cut the budgets during the darkest times of the Second World War, he was asked to cut the budgets of the National Endowment of the Arts and the Humanities, and he said, well, what are we fighting for then? Uh-huh. What's the point? And I think that's the big story here, that you can listen to our shared world by listening to the music that we've created, and you can understand where our life was at if you read the novels and the poetry of whatever time we're interested in. So that's the big story. The smaller story, which is what I'm trying to talk about in my last book, is it's also very practical and helpful. So people talk about art, particularly in America, about art and music and museums as something you do on Sundays in your spare time that is sort of a luxury for the wealthy. And there's something to be said about that. It's very luxurious to do. Yet I think engaging with art is the most advanced way of learning about others and engaging with other times and other ways of thinking.
It also provides the context for understanding everything.
Right. But it also, if you want to understand how to sell cars in China, it's nice to understand what it's like to be a Chinese driver or somebody buying the first car in the history of the family. If you want to sell mobile phones in Brazil, It's nice to understand what it is like to be a 17-year-old woman that's buying her first mobile phone and what her life is like in order to service that person. So I think the humanities is not the only place, but it's the most advanced and the best place to learn about these skills of putting yourself into other people's world and engaging with that world in a sophisticated way. So I just find that the people that are most helpful for me in my company and that we hire are trained in history, art history, literature,
There's a study you cite from a company called, or a research outfit called PayScale, INC,
Right.
is that correct?
Right.
And what did they find? What was the...
Well, not surprisingly, they find that if you come out of college with a computer science degree, your likelihood of making money and getting a job is higher in the first years compared to people coming out of the humanities. But if you take the top 5%, if you take the best earners, the people that make most money in the country, and you can care about that or not, but it's sort of one measure of success. And there's a big weight on people with a humanities background. So if you look at the people that run our banks, if you look at the people who run the big financial institutions, they have a history or French background. They're rounded people.
Theater.
Exactly. They're interested in so many things.
Anthropology, psychology, philosophy.
Exactly. So what I've seen in the big corporations that I worked in, there is a glass ceiling for people without a rounded understanding of culture and language and so on. And if you don't have that, which is something you get from being in the humanities, you have a hard time competing on the top jobs. And that comes out in that data. It comes out that people with a humanities background at the very top are overrepresented 3 times over engineering.
And that it obviously is not because they have a piece of paper that says, I had a degree in philosophy from Yale. It is because the proof is in the pudding.
Exactly.
It is because it makes a substantive difference if you've studied humanities and you've reflected on questions of being and human beings. So in that sense, when I've sort of over time reflected on this process and investigated this turn, I do actually, and I wonder if you feel the same way, I think that the point in which this started to change, this is a very difficult sort of thing to discuss because, of course, the Enlightenment was very important, and before that there was a lot of darkness. So I don't mean to suggest that we were on the right path before the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was wonderful. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but clearly there was this move towards a more scientific worldview in which we looked increasingly to model the world and to find ways to create deterministic systems and ways of understanding everything. And that's something that we've discussed on the show often, with complexity and Newtonian mechanics and Newtonian principles and neoclassical models in economics, etc. But there has been this abandonment of phronesis, so to speak. So, I look at it really since the Enlightenment, but do you see it as a sort of a more or less linear trend? Or do you see that there have been certain periods, for example, the Industrial Revolution, or even today, where we've been hastier in our sort of jettisoning of these humanities or of these non-scientific ways of spending our time and thinking about the world?
I think I am an empiricist. I'm into science in so many ways. And I think natural sciences have been spectacularly successful since the Enlightenment. Yet there is a fundamental mistake in thinking that we humans can be not our bodies, but our shared world and our culture can be studied with the same technique and the same tools as you study bacteria or asteroids. I think you have to have a clear difference between the natural world, and you can call the universe, and our world, the human world, and what Heidegger, who's one of my sort of the people I'm interested in, calls worlds. So that would be the world of finance, the world of media, the world of radio, the world of art, and so on. They have their worlds that are human and designed by humans and created by humans and are not helpfully understood through the means of natural science. And I get a problem when you start using natural science techniques on that. That's when you see the most misunderstanding and the most absurdities. I mean, I think economics is the area of economics is the area that sort of systematically gets things wrong, because they use, I mean, almost every time, it's ridiculous, because they use the wrong techniques to understand human beings.
Absolutely.
So I'm not saying that I'm against science and I'm against the Enlightenment, but I think there was a mistake in the Enlightenment, which was in René Descartes, really. And that came from Plato, which is this idea that all we are thinking things, and that we have complete transparency to our brains, and through our brains we have transparency to our preferences, to our will, to what we want in life. And I think Heidegger was the first one to sort of show that that's not true. He sort of reversed that 180 degrees and said, we are not described very well by thinking. We are doing things. We are engaging in worlds. And that's a different thing than sitting back and thinking through things. We can do that. We can sometimes look at objects and say, I wonder what that is. You know, and his example is, of course, hammering. So you can look at a hammer and you can say, that's a weird wooden shank with a metal blob at the end. But it's rare we do that. It's more likely that we know what a hammer is, that it's connected to wood and nails and houses and carpentry and so on. And that's the world of carpentry. And we know how to engage with objects in that way, which is exactly not the way that René Descartes or Plato or others talk about objects. So for me, he was sort of a break with a 2,000-year misunderstanding of human beings. And everything since, you know, Being in Time was published in the end of the 1920s, has been about that. It's either been in the world of philosophy, it's been a reaction against it, or a development of it in my book. And you can read the history of Western philosophy through that lens as sort of a different description of who we are as human beings. And all we've done in my company is we've taken that seriously and said, well, if it's true that we engage in the world, then we need to study people in a different way than asking them, because we don't know, which is why surveys are wrong, which is why we can't predict elections, which is why focus groups, as your old boss said, should be neglected, and why you should observe people and try to make sense of them in a different way.
Reality is messy.
It is.
And data is fuzzy.
Yeah.
No, I feel you on that. And so what you're describing there in terms of the progression of Western philosophy is that fuzzy divergence between those who seek to find a very deterministic, quantifiable measure of self, of world, of object, of value, etc., and those like Heidegger or Wittgenstein who take a more qualitative picture, a qualitative view. And certainly with what you're describing there with the hammer, experience matters.
Exactly.
And it's not a black box where we say, okay, you know, it doesn't matter what's going on in the inside. We can ignore the problem of consciousness. There's actually this really great, I love Terence McKenna. I think he's got such incredible, he's said so many beautiful things, one of which was, and I just know this because I was looking for some stuff on my social media to create social media, because it's a tremendous amount of work actually doing social media. It exhausts me. I found this great interview of his, and I took a short clip of it, where he said it's a failure of the theory of evolution that it cannot account for human consciousness, which after all created the theory of evolution. Right. So I think we can't get away from that fundamental problem, which is that we are the measure of reality of all things. We are the ones having the experience.
Right. Yeah, so Heidegger he would say, well, there will be planets and there will be objects in the world without us, yet they wouldn't be called planets and forks and rivers. They would just be stuff. And it's us that gives it names and categorizes it and so on, which is a meaningful thing to study as well. And the problem with that is that there's no view from nowhere with that. You can't be a robot and study it. You have to be a human to understand that that's a river and that's a fork. And you have to understand what is relevant right now. Is the dust on the floor relevant, or is it the conversation happening right here that's relevant? Figuring that out is very hard. And that's why they in Silicon Valley run into the problems with AI all the time, is that they can't crack the problem that you talk about, which is consciousness. And they can't figure out generalized AI, right? Which is wanting to do something, being startled about something, being wonder about the universe, wanting to understand how to create warp speed things that could send us to Alpha Centauri. All those kinds of wishes to do things is something that they can't figure out. And they're not an iota closer to that than they were in the 60s. They've been much better at creating closed systems, algorithmic things that you basically could do on a piece of paper. They can just do it with a computer way faster than we can. But the human problem and the problem of the really hard problem, they haven't gotten closer to, and I don't think they will.
Let's talk about this, because you and I, we spoke a little bit before this, and we've both read Bostrom's book, and it sounds like you're very into this subject, and it's been something that I've wanted to cover on the show, and I have not found the right guest to do it, but I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation with you on this right now. What is the hard problem of AI? And first of all, we're talking about general AI versus narrow AI. We're talking about AI in the way that the public and the popular culture conceptualizes it, which is a form of super intelligence, computer intelligence that is competitive with or surpasses human intelligence.
Right. There used to be good old-fashioned AI in the 60s or 50s.
That was the term, good old-fashioned AI.
Yeah, GoFi, basically.
Yeah, GoFi.
And that was the idea that you can feed a machine with enough information for it to have a complete map of the world. And we thought that, or humans thought that, especially humans attending the University of MIT, thought that our brain was a map of the world with concepts that we then projected onto the world. So when you saw a fork, you would say fork, because of that, because you would sort of add up all the aspects of the fork to become a fork. And they found that was a dead end, and it was dead for 30 years. And now they're back, in a way, with a split of the concept of AI, from being AI to being general AI and specific, or more specific AI. And more specific AI is really just advanced software. It's just like a spreadsheet is better at calculating than I am, and has been since the early 80s. It's just a very advanced version, very fast.
And an element of machine learning there as well.
Yeah, right. But there's been machine learning for a long time. The really hard problem is the other side, which is we can have the will to say, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could go to other galaxies? Or wouldn't it be wonderful if we could cure cancer? Something like that. Getting a machine to have will, to have wonder, to have inspiration, to want to learn, that's the really hard problem. And that's something that Heidegger calls it, that we are the only being in the known universe that takes a stand on its own being, that thinks about its own identity all the time. So as far as we know, a fox doesn't think, I wonder if I should be more wolf-like today, or something like that. And an asteroid don't have sort of internal social strife with whether it got dressed well this morning. It doesn't have a sort of social panic over the wrong haircut. Yet we, as beings, have that all the time. We have a constant dialogue with ourselves in terms of who we are and where we are and so on. And we engage in the world, in worlds that are constructed in a particular way that he describes in his book. And I think that is something that they have a hard time figuring out. Which world are we in? Are we in the world now of radio? Are we in the world of philosophy? Are we in the world of birthday parties? You know, what's the world you are in? Getting a machine to understand that now I'm in the world of birthday parties, but I'm talking about AI or whatever it is, that's really hard for them. So the direction of the intent behind a direction, you can get a machine to figure out by feeding it a lot of pictures. You can get it to figure out whether a mold is benign or not. But wanting to do that in the first place is the hard problem.
Choice.
And will to, and interest in doing so, leaning in to a particular area. What Bostrom is saying in his book is the really scary problem is if we get just an ounce of that, just the minimal version of that, what would that look like? And his example is, let's say we tell an AI that it has to make paper clips. And his example is paper clips. And it starts replicating itself because it really wants to make paper clips. And it doesn't have anything else in its world than paper clips. Then it'll start replicating itself, and it'll start getting rid of things that's between it and making paper clips. And suddenly you have a world made of paper clips very, very fast because of the replication capabilities of computers.
That's its goal. Or I think he has another one as well, which is okay, well, what if, that's silly and we don't, someone will say, well, okay, no one's going to say paperclips. What if, the goal, the central goal, axiomatic goal of this AI is to generate human happiness? Well, what if the AI decides that human beings would be maximally happy with a slightly lobotomized brain? Right. You said something essentially to that regard.
Which is probably true. But,
it goes back to your point about an asteroid doesn't have internal conflict.
Exactly. So the day I see a computer having social stigma or something like that, or being startled about something, playing Go, right? If it gets startled over a move, I'll be willing to talk about, we have a real situation now. But before that, it's just software in my book. It's very advanced software, but it's just software.
And of course, that doesn't get to the other dilemma, which is we have no idea and we can't know what a machine is or is not feeling and is or is not experiencing. So that brings us back to square one in many ways.
Right. There's a Werner Herzog movie called Lo and Behold out right now.
It's a documentary. That's a documentary, right?
And he has a question he asks everybody. It is, does the internet dream of itself? Mm-hmm. Which is exactly a good question, right? Does it have those kinds of weird human things, which is we can dream of ourselves. And if you think about your dream world, it's a rather complex thing that we don't even understand. So how about we spend some time on understanding that rather than thinking we can have the machines do it?
Mm-hmm. What do you think about, because this is, to me, I find it a little nuts, what I'm about to talk about now, and it has to do with the discussion on AI, which is this other popular notion, which is that we can simply upload our consciousness to a server.
Right.
To me, that one is the easiest one to simply debunk. At its most basic level, we have no concept of what consciousness is. I think of AI as applied philosophy.
Right.
I think it's, I think of it in that sort of a way.
Yeah.
What do you think of this other culture and this could bring us into a larger discussion about Silicon Valley bubble thinking and sort of how it is or it is not representative of the larger society. What do you think about this quest for immortality?
Right.
That is finding new life in Silicon Valley.
I think it's laughable and stupid. I mean, it's the more bubble-esque they become in Silicon Valley, the bigger the goals. It's no longer curing cancer, it's ending death. It's no longer fixing this world, it's going to Mars. And, I think it's great to go to Mars, but thinking about it as some sort of philanthropic endeavor is ridiculous. So that's the first. And the second thing is that the heart of that problem is the singularity idea, is this idea that everything is exponential and that technology will happen exponentially. And if it does, then we can eventually, a few days before Ray Kurzweil dies, he can upload himself to the... It's interesting that it's always before the prophet dies that this kind of thing will happen in his own prophecy.
When you're, just for our listeners who may not know, when you refer to the singularity, you're referring to the term coined. Was it coined by Ray Kurzweil?
Yeah, it was.
Which is that roughly around the year 2050, but it's not. It doesn't have to be a specific date, but there's a point in which machine intelligence will surpass human intelligence.
So I think it's moving back. The sicker he feels, the earlier it becomes.
Well, he takes a lot. He takes 5,000 supplements a day. He takes a ton of pills
in order to sustain himself till the day where he can upload himself to the cloud and download himself into a new body.
It's a very, there's a great documentary. I don't know if you've seen the documentary on him. And this is very interesting in the context of our conversation right now, because when I watched that documentary, I don't know the man personally. I saw a person who was dealing with the grief of having lost his father. Mm-hmm. And the fear that is so common that human beings have dealt with since they became aware of death, which is the fear of death, the fear of the unknown. Right. And he's dealing with all of those things, like all of us, but it's very interesting to see how it manifests in his life, which is this pursuit for the Holy Grail, for the what's the term in mythology, for the fountain of youth. Mm.
I mean, one thing is that you have bonkers people like that walking around, and I think that they're sort of interesting to listen to, but but that they become the ideology of a economic powerhouse like Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And it's the only really driving idea out there is too much. I was pitched by an editor to write a book called The Singularity is Far, Far Away, because they're not getting closer
That's
to...
a play off of Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near.
Exactly. And
that's just your editor. The editor has strong PR instincts.
Exactly. And I thought that was a fun idea. But it's just that they haven't gotten closer to the core and hardest problem. They've gotten way better at other things, but what's so wrong about that? What's so wrong about celebrating all the things we can do with the technology rather than wishing we go to Mars and ending death? I think there are other things to do.
And I think even the notion of ending death is for me, it's within the realm of scientific inquiry. What seems to me, where I totally see no capacity for understanding, is when I'm told about uploading consciousness. I just find that so absurd on its face, because you can't tell me that you even know what that is. You have no concept of it. And in fact, you have no idea what an upload is within the concept of the fact that you don't know. I mean, we could go real deep into this fact. I have no idea where I am. I'm living in a matrix of my own brain. This is not in dispute.
Right.
So to look through a microscope and tell me that you see what you see, well, you're also looking through your eye, and where are you even in this scenario, and who is you, and what am I? I mean, these are basic philosophical questions, and yes, I think to bring it back to how we started this conversation, I think everyone who is very brilliant and doing tremendous work in Silicon Valley and everywhere else would benefit tremendously from reflecting on and taking courses in the humanities and in philosophy, because these are essential questions.
I'd actually say it's in Silicon Valley, they focus on small things or extremely large, out of the way things. So either it is big brains dealing with small things like how do we share pictures, or how do, that sort of thing, or very, very large things like Mars and endless life. And I think there might be a slice in between those two, like how do we heal, and how do we deal with our healthcare system, and how do we create food for enough people, and so on, that are also worthy of some attention.
Who was it? Now I'm blanking. She's a writer, Gillian Tett.
Right.
Do you remember what she said to the economy?
I wasn't there. I know her
you
quite
weren't
well.
Yeah. Okay, so she said something. Well, I would love to have her on the show. I spoke to her. Maybe you can help me. And she said something really great that stuck in my head, which was that the culture of Silicon Valley today reminds her, not exactly, but close, to the culture in finance prior to 2008. And I really related to that. Right. I said, yes, I feel that as well. I do sense that sort of, that was the notion in the derivatives market and in the mathematical modeling of securities, that were somehow able to take risk and just dispense it into the ether, which it defied logic.
It's wanting a truth machine. It's the machine that can watch over us in its grace and make sure that we have no risk in our markets, and we can get our marketing algorithms perfectly tuned, and we can get everything sort of tuned into a system that will tell us what the future will be like. And I don't understand why they so wish for that, but it certainly is.
It's a religious desire.
It is.
It's a religious desire. It's for the Father. For God. There's so much of this, it feeds into the same rudimentary mechanism, whatever that is, of human beings' search for meaning. And that's why it's so important, I think, to reflect on these, to recognize that you're not the first person to have these thoughts, and that the way in which you are expressing them is your particular expression. But, make no mistake, there is something here that is universal.
Right.
So let me ask you this, in the context of the fact, so we're describing one culture, which is Silicon Valley. Let's talk about, and I do want to get into what you do, because you have some fascinating case studies that you've presented in your book, and I'm aware of as well with your company. Tell me how you view culture overall. It's such a difficult question for me to express, right? Because, where do you even begin? I live in this bubble of New York. It's hard enough for me to get out of the New York culture to think about the wider American culture. There was so much shock in the large cities of the United States over the most recent election. How do I even wrap my head around the way that people live in Africa or Indonesia or in China? Tell me a little bit about how you view the world culturally, and that's the best I can do to express my question.
Right. So we are asked by companies and sometimes public institutions, but mostly companies, about what is going on among our customers or our customers' customers or whatever it is. And in order to do that, we have to get out of our bubble. Anthropology is one technique that is developed over the last 100 years of going and spending enough time with and in another culture in order to understand and see the world the way they see it. So that's what we do. And I think the only answer to your question is I don't know. But I can send skilled people to go and try to understand what's going on in Western China when it comes to how they eat or something like that. We can study cultural phenomena fairly rigorously and actually empirically by observing reality, and we can use that to understand what that phenomena looks like and how that works. So let's say you want to study tea in China. Tea to the Chinese is as advanced as wine is to the French. It's something that you drink for particular conversations, particular type of tea, for particular situations. There's a particular price point of tea or fanciness of the tea and so on. So understanding that whole world is a pretty big deal. If your own world is sweetened, peach-flavored, cold, bottled tea, right? And understanding brewing techniques and so on, that takes a while. And you can't just send out a questionnaire through SurveyMonkey and then people click a little bit and tell you that. You have to go and experience what it's like and understand by being quiet for a little bit and just observing and listening. So we're big proponents of being introverted listeners and looking at the world and trying to make sense of it and see what makes sense for these people and truly put yourself into their shoes. And the reason why I talk so much about the humanities is that's what you're doing when you're a historian. When you're a historian, you want to understand Napoleon or the Duke of Windsor. You go into piece together their world through pictures and paintings and objects that you find from the time and notes that people have written down, and you try to piece out or create a picture of what that was like to be the Duke of Windsor and saying no to the English crown, or being Napoleon and losing in Waterloo. What was that like? What was his life like? What was his world like? So piecing it together through a set of different sorts of data, not just quantitative, but aesthetic, practical, all kinds of objects and situations and practices that are going on in the cultural field, and figure out what makes sense to that and what makes sense to them in their world. What are the way they construct their world? And that is immensely helpful if you are a CEO of a big company and you have several layers between you and the world. People will prepare everything for you, and you will lead a very comfortable life that is far away from the reality of these people. So if it was somebody selling tea in China, it's helpful to know what's tea to them, right? And what language do they use and what practices do they have around?
And that's also this, you're touching on numerous occasions that you're touching on that distinction between Descartes and Heidegger. And is our introspection enough to tell us what we need to know about the world, or do we need to go out and experience?
Exactly. Or can we ask them to introspect? Can we send out 3,000 questionnaires to people and ask them to introspect about how they do something? We don't know why we do something. Do you know how you drive? Do you know how you don't know those things?
It's funny when you're talking, you're reminding me when I worked on the technology side of television on application development and design and user experience. And when I was overseeing a focus group in 2009, it was for a brand new remote that we were designing. That was a motion remote that went along with this new interface that we had been building for the set-top box. And I remember being so exhausted by all the different people's opinions. I thought to myself, how am I supposed to make sense of all of this? You know what I mean? And I think that, again, speaks to there's also a simple desire to just come up with an answer that works. That so often is what drives these outcomes, which is I need to jam the solution into this narrow model, into this confining sort of thing, which I think also speaks to something else that I think about often, and I wanted to speak with you about as well, which is to what extent are we actually just creating a world that is more adapted for machines and less adapted for human beings, rather than us being able to merge with machines or whatever else. I mean, I feel like in many ways we're building a society that increasingly pushes away the things that make us human and the things that matter.
That's why I wrote the book. I mean, I know there are snake soil people everywhere and any time, but I just found that the brain scanning people and the data people were saying things that they couldn't prove at all. And that's not such a big problem. The big problem is that somebody took notes. Smart people took notes from nonsense as long as it was natural science looking. And I just found, have we lost our ability to be critical? Have we lost our ability to, have we undermined our innate ability to be in touch with others? And I think we are educating our kids out of it. I think we are undermining the research in the area. Right now on the floor in the House, there's a bill to take out the remaining small percentage of humanities, federal funded humanities research, the National Endowment of the Arts, gone. So we are undermining our own ability, our innate ability to do these things. And that's not good. And it's sort of boring too.
Some of the best programming in the United States has come out of PBS.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have to rely on advertising.
Yeah.
Sesame Street. I mean, I could name a number of programs.
Yeah, and what culture doesn't have museums and publicly funded, research in our art history? I think that should be part of any civilized place.
To bring back, there's something else I wanted to mention that I didn't want to forget when you were speaking, which is, I think another central problem here is the reason why there is this bias towards quantification is because the qualitative doesn't scale as well as quantitative.
Right.
That sort of problem of how do we deal with a market that views T in the way that we view Y, and that's a difficult bridge to gap. People want easy solutions. Again, so much of this is about laziness.
Yeah, you would have to go to Western China. It would be rather uncomfortable. You'd get stomach disease from the spicy food. You would have to sit in an airplane. You would have to engage with people that doesn't speak English very well.
Yeah.
That's messy.
Wasn't it one of George Soros' traders at Quantum Fund who at one point he left the fund, or I don't think he was still part of the fund, but he went and lived in Sweden for a while?
Finland, yeah. That was Robert Johnson, yeah.
Right.
Who said that in order to understand what the Finnish government would do and so on, we would need to be in Finland. He was also the one that talked about the difference between the German and the British culture and why the Germans wouldn't let the British change the collaboration on the pound and the Deutschmark and so on. So that's a cultural perspective on finance that was helpful enough to bring down the Bank of England.
That's a great story, regardless. I should do an episode on this show just on that.
You should get Robert in. I mean, that
would be great.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a great story. You're talking about when George Soros, essentially, he gained notoriety as the man who broke the Bank of England because he shorted the British pound during the period of ERM when the UK was sort of moving towards entering the euro. And that was an incredible story.
Right. So basically, they bet on the Germans wouldn't give the British the flexibility to devalue the pound because they were pissed at the British. And so they bet on a cultural feel rather than an analytical.
And on George Soros's back pain.
Exactly.
Notoriously always gets back pain. His sons, I don't know if you mentioned that in your book. I don't remember seeing that, but his son always says that, my father will give you all sorts of, logical reasons why he makes a decision, but in the end, he moves out of a position based on lower back pain. Right,
but it's interesting to think about that because you also, I'm sure, have a feeling of the market. It might maybe your stomach or it's
sure.
somewhere else, but we all have an ability to align ourselves and adjust ourselves to the mood around us. So the mood of the nation is something we feel. The difference between us and George Soros is that he listens to it. So he listens.
And he has the conviction. Oof.
And the balls. To bet 3 times capital.
Oh my God.
On something like that. And he's done it over and over again because
God.
He sees himself as a reflection of the market and he relates to that kind of knowledge, which is a kind of knowledge. It's a knowledge to feel that the New York feels different now than it did 6 months ago before the election. But we can feel it. It's a real fact that New York feels different. Just like you can say a party is great or a party is good or the mood in the room is downwards or whatever it is. It's something that we can discuss and talk about and relate to, and that has a lot to do with markets. So what they bet on is interesting. They bet on the reactions to the reactions of something, right? So you have an event, then people react to it, and then other people react to those reactions, and that's what you want to know. And that's why they're so extremely successful, because they look somewhere else than everybody else.
Well, that's a great point, because, one of the arguments I often get into with some of my friends when we have the little arguments about this is you're not trading based on what you think markets will do in response to XYZ. You're making a bet based on what you think the market thinks is someone else is going to do. It's exactly. A multi-order derivative decision-making process, so it's very out there as far as not being quantifiable.
And the difference with Soros and others is that he's honest about it.
He's honest about the fact that it is a qualitative.
That's the case.
There's also this great, one of our other guests that we had here, Sebastian Mallaby, who is the biographer of Alan Greenspan, has this great moment in his book where Alan Greenspan is now, who is a classic data sleuth. He got a seat on the exchange across the street from his office, and he went down there and he decided to cut out the middleman and basically make some additional profits because he wouldn't have to go between an intermediary broker. And what he found was he was getting slaughtered. And he started listening to sort of understanding why was this happening. And he was hearing these guys saying, I really feel the market's getting choppy. He's like, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean it's getting choppy? What do you mean if you feel it's bottoming? What do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot deny that is a human experience. Mm-hmm. It takes denial to push that out of your model. And again, that's because I think in large part it's inconvenient. Mm-hmm. And it requires a tremendous amount of work and effort. So before we wrap up this interview, Christian, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the great, interesting stuff that you do with your company, at least one case. Now, what role have you played with Ford? I'm fascinated with Ford because I'm fascinated. You mentioned Lincoln. And the new Lincolns, specifically the Continental, has stood out for me. I mean, I've seen that car on the street, and there's no other car. Volkswagen has a nice new model somewhere I've seen. It's not out yet. It's a concept car. But like that car, when it hit the street, I was wowed by it. And when then I read your book and I realized that this was, obviously must have been, but this was a conscious decision by the company to reinstate luxury in the brand. Tell me a little bit about this process, because I think this is an interesting story.
Right. So luxury is many things, right? To many people, it can be an apple in season, or it can be a spa, or it can be whatever. So we looked into, among the target group of the people that buy these kind of cars that are $60,000 and up, what's luxurious to them? And if you look at the industry, it seems like, if you look at BMW or Mercedes or anybody, it seems like it's driving really fast in a really fast car on an empty road. That's sort of the experience among beautiful mountains. That's the luxurious experience. Yet then spend time with people that have luxurious cars. First of all, they don't drive it themselves. They have drivers, particularly in China and India. And secondly, they sit in traffic all day. And they're just stuck in traffic. So we thought about what would a different luxurious experience be. If we want to be quiet, you'll want to be very clean, because the cities of the world are not that anymore. It'll be one where you can work. It'll be one where you can have meetings. It'll be one that's rather different from sitting right up and driving a really fast car. So the idea was to move the entire luxurious experience towards something that was low, chunky, very quiet, very clean.
It is chunky. It's funny you say that.
It's a flight. Chunky. It's a flight rather than a drive, and it has sort of the seats are thick and big and comforting. Yeah. So the idea was to sort of create a whole other focus on luxury, and then also on top of that build a range of services that would make owning the car feel luxurious, and that the value of the car would go up the longer you owned it, because we would add services all along. So the idea was to redefine what luxury was based on an understanding of spending time with people in the big cities of the world, and look at how to create a quiet flight rather than a fast ride out of the experience. And out of that has come a whole range of things. But the last launch and the next launch of the Navigator will be focused on that.
Wow.
But the real deal will happen after 2020, when we can do much more around assisted driving, and we can do we don't know about driverless cars yet, because there's still a whole lot of technology problems, and everybody has those problems, by the way. But given certain technological breakthroughs, we would be able to do a whole lot with the car that would make it delightful again to be in a car, because right now it's not fun.
Because you're stuck in traffic all the time.
Yeah. And, there are people saying, why do you put speedometers that go above 30 miles an hour? We're never, ever going above 30 miles an hour because we're stuck in traffic all the time. It's a good vision to run 100 miles an hour down an empty country road, but it's just not my reality.
That's such a great point. I never thought of it that way.
So the idea was to switch to a relevant kind of luxury that would be very different from all the German sort of cars.
You also, when you were speaking and comparing it to an airplane, I thought about an innovation. I don't remember who. For some reason, I have it in my mind connected with Richard Branson and Virgin. But it was the idea to put Wi-Fi into airplanes. Because, okay, you're going to spend 6 hours. Would I rather have 6 hours in a flight with nothing to do, or would I rather have 7 hours in a flight on Wi-Fi? And that's a big question. And so that's an innovation that has to do with the experience, right?
Right. Richard Branson is the master of taking something completely standard and then tweaking 2-3 experience buttons.
Guy's a genius.
That completely changes the experience. So an airplane becomes a nightclub or whatever it is, just by changing the lights.
Oh, man, yeah.
And he does the cheapest things with the most massive impact really well.
Yeah.
That's his real genius, I think. Other than his balls. I mean, he's just brass balls in terms
For
of
sure.
the kinds of things he's doing.
He has, also his branding model is, was he the first to really take that approach, which was to take a particular brand, an experience, and move it across sectors?
Yeah. The only area he didn't do it was the condoms. He didn't think Virgin would be a relevant name for that. But
he had thought about it?
Yeah, they thought about Virgin condoms, and they thought that maybe that's problematic. But everything else, I mean, Virgin Bride and Virgin phones and Virgin everything.
That would be problematic.
Yeah, it's at least it stops you in the track for a second.
Well, Christian, I really appreciate having you on. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, a rare radio conversation.
Yeah,
this kind of time.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and I should look to get Jilly and Ted on, but thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And that was my episode with Christian Madsbjerg. I want to thank Christian for being on my program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforcespod.com. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforcespod.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.